G'day everyone. Today the technique that we're going to explore is the Adobe Illustrator 3D effect. And with the 3D effect you can make things like this. With the new version we can get this sort of nice ray traced effect and create very convincing 3D shapes and graphics. In the first video we're going to just get an overview of the tool and look at how we can use the various aspects of it to create a range of 3D items. So let's grab a new document. I'm going to go File, New, and I'm going to create a document that's 1920 by 1080 pixels wide, horizontal, and we'll work in RGB color. Windy around here today. Let's go create and have a look what we can do with the 3D tool. I'll just close a few of these windows to get a bit more space here. Okay, so what we need to create a 3D object in Illustrator is a vector to start with, and I'm going to grab just a square, zoom into that a little bit, and I don't know, we'll give it a grey colour. Alright, so there's a vector, and to turn it into a 3D object, we need to go to the Effects, 3D and Materials. Now I've got a range of options here. Let's start by clicking on, well, you select any of these and you get to the same kind of working interface. So let's start with Extrude and Bevel. And this is our, smaller. This is our 3D and Materials workspace, I suppose. And currently we have Extrude selected, and you can see that we've created like almost the beginnings of a cube. Let's dig into the properties that we can adjust when we're extruding a vector. To start with, we can adjust the depth of our extrusion. So I'm going to work towards a bit of a cube. We've got a couple of funny options here where we can twist our extrusion or taper it, so that might be quite good. We can almost go to a pyramid shape with the taper. We can also kind of see through our cube, take the cap off it, and we can bevel that object as well, which is kind of good. I'll just click off there and you can see the bevel. A few different types of bevels, and each of the bevels can be adjusted with its height and its width. I like to use the rounded bevel option. I think that's quite useful. Kind of rounded objects at times. I'm going to turn that off and see if we can just try and arrange that a little bit better so that we can see all of the options. How can I get that to sit on this very small screen? That'll do it, I think. Oh no, we've got heaps of... There we go. Sorry, just got to fix that up because I've got two screens running at the same time. So we'll just move past the bevel option and we'll have a look at the rotation option down here, which is actually a pretty complicated, often confusing set of parameters that we can adjusts, but it allows us to kind of rotate and look at different sides of our extrusion or the model that we're working on. We've got a bunch of presets that we can look at. Like I can look at the front, the top, and then we can look at various kind of elevations of our extrusion. The off-axis front is often pretty good, and I quite like working with the isometric views as well. They give us some good kind of spaces to work with. It is a bit confusing, however, because when we rotate the object, we do also rotate its light source at the same time. So that's something strange and interesting to get your head around. We do have a set of sliders as well where we can rotate our object on the X, Y, and the Z axes. So for example, if we start off with a front elevation, we can rotate on the X axis, the Y axis, and the Z axis. I am going to set it back to the front here, and just scroll back and just drop my extrusion back a little bit so it's a bit more of a cube rather than a rectangle. We've got we've got a couple of other option tabs we can look at in the workspace. Firstly, the materials section, where we can select a material to add to our model, and there's a range of Adobe Substance materials here that we can apply. Kind of some pretty quirky sorts of things. Click on the whatever this is, stylized concrete, and you can see that that's added pretty severe kind of texture to the object there. When we do select on one of those substance textures, they are procedural, so there's a range of properties and values that then you can then manipulate. We've got quite a considerable amount of options for adjusting this particular procedural texture. I'm going to go back to the material and not kind of worry about the default material, and kind of skip through the materials very quickly at this stage. On the default material, we do have these base properties of kind of roughness and metallics. So if I bring up the metallic there, it will kind of increase the specular highlights of our and sort of the reflection values, and also change the quality of the shadows, part of the rendering. Which kind of brings me to discussing this little option up here, which is the render with ray trace, which allows us to add a kind of a bit more realism to the rendering of our 3D objects. I'll just turn that on. Kind of can't see a whole lot more changing there with this particular item, so I'll flick it back off. We'll get back to it in a second. Tab over to the lighting option here, which allows us to change the way the light falls onto our object. You can see here that the light's maybe somewhere over this part of the world, shining onto our object here and casting shadows over to this back side. We can change the intensity of our lighting. We can change where the sun is in relation to our objects. We can change how far away the sun is, if it's kind of really far away or if it's quite close. And we can sort of diffuse the light a bit, which is useful. There's also an ambient lighting option here. So the ambient lighting kind of just backlights and fills the light in the space, which is adds a kind of level of complexity to the way the light falls into your object. There's a couple of different ways or sort of defaults for your where your light is positioned and its settings. You've got it falling from the right, the top left, and this diffuse option, which is kind of good sometimes. We'll go back to the standard. Another option here is to add a shadow into our rendering, which is pretty good. There's two options for the position of the shadow behind the object, but below the object, as if it's sitting on a kind of a ground plane. We can also make the object kind of float above the ground plane. And we've also got this bounding box option, which sort of crops the shadow. I don't find much use for the shadow bounds slider. I'm often putting it right up to 400 so it's not interrupting me. So let's go back to the ray trace, and we can see our standard kind of rendering of our object here. And if we click on the ray trace of that object, you'll see that kind of adds a little bit more kind of subtlety to the way the object is rendering. Might adjust the lighting here just a little bit, change the position of where our sun is, maybe the height, increase the ambient lighting, and the softness, which is going to drop our shadow, allow our kind of shadow to dissipate into the distance. I might increase the intensity a little bit, just sort of playing around with things here. The height, let's drop it back to standard. That's our first 3D object created. You might have noticed, just to finish off this first part, a collection, well, this sort of widget for manipulating your 3D space actually on the canvas, and that's useful to some degree. You can see we can click and drag the widget, and we've got the X, Y, and Z axes that we can manipulate here. We'll turn it on the Z axis, and we'll swap over to the Z axis, and finally the Y axis there. Alright, so we've got going with our 3D. Pop back in a sec with another video, and we'll look at some of the other 3D type options